Outstanding. Thank you, Anise. Amazing. All right, now it's time to meet our guest speaker, who came all the way from our nation's capital, Derek Thompson. Thompson is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He is a contributor to CBS News. He's a news analyst for the NPR show Here and Now, and he's host of the podcast Plain English. I'll put a little plug in for Plain English. I've done a lot of research on Derek the last couple months, and it's fabulous content. And he's an amazing interviewer, which makes it hard for me to be the interviewer interviewing the interviewee, right? He's also the author of best-selling book Hitmakers, How to Succeed in an Age of Distraction, and Derek Thompson on work and anthology of his essays about labor and technology in The Atlantic. I've been looking forward to this since I was given the assignment. Come on out, Derek. Join us on stage. Welcome. Welcome to Oregon.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming in. Came in hot last night, I think, so appreciate you being here.
It's great to be here.
So as I mentioned, there is so much content that you could cover with Derek. We literally could be here all day. And the one that I really want to talk to him about is baseball, but we'll save that for maybe backstage, okay? So the main reason why we're here is really, your topic of the abundance agenda. And that writing that you did that basically called out a lot of things. So maybe just, give us a high-level look at the abundance agenda, your thought about that, and then we'll kind of dive into that from there.
Yeah, so one of the more important and, to me, more passionate projects the last few years of my writing and podcasting has been this idea that I call the abundance agenda. And the abundance agenda really emerged from two gaps that I saw and was frustrated by in America. The first gap is the gap that I saw as a sort of center progressive between what we say and what we do. So we say that housing is a human right, but it is prohibitively expensive to build housing in the bluest states and deep blue cities in America. We have this set of rules that makes it almost impossible to meet population growth with housing growth, despite the fact that liberals keep saying housing is a human right. We don't build enough of it. We say, for example, that we have to fix climate change, that it is the challenge of our generation. And yet, many of us make it almost impossible to build clean energy, at least until, Senator Wyden was talking about the IRA and its subsidies, its carrots to get us going. But even so, we have rules that make it incredibly difficult to build the solar energy that we need. We're shutting down wind turbines on the East Coast. We've made it absolutely impossible to build nuclear technology in this country. We have closed more nuclear power plants than we've opened in the 21st century. I mean, that is a shanda if what we want to do is decarbonize America. We say, for example, that healthcare is absolutely essential to making a decent life in America, and yet there are deliberate rules on the books that constrict the number of doctors and nurses that can work in America. So over and over and over again, you see this gap between what we say, the values we profess, and the laws and the regulations that we write. And that was pissing me off. So I wrote this idea called the abundance agenda. I said what we need is to identify what is good, what are the material bedrocks of a good life in the 21st century, and how do we do this simple, stupid thing of making more of that stuff, of putting our money where our mouth is. The second gap that I saw as I did more and more research is there's this frustrating gap between what Americans invent and what we build. We are the most ingenious inventors in the world. We win all the Nobel Prizes in the sciences and physics and mathematics. But if there was a Nobel Prize for actually building what we invent, we'd be at the bottom of the list. We invented the elevator. Elijah Otis invented the elevator. So why does the US have such a hard time building buildings that have elevators in them in downtown areas? We invented the semiconductor. Why is the frontier of semiconductor and chip technology in East Asia rather than in East Oregon? We built and invented the solar chip. We invented the solar chip at Bell Labs in the 1950s. Why don't we have the frontier in solar chip technology? Why don't we lead the world in solar chip installation? We invented nuclear power. We don't build it, South Korea does. So over and over again, I became really frustrated by the fact that America's lack of an abundance agenda has nothing to do with our lack of intelligence. We have so much intelligence, but where is our will to actually build what we invent?
So well said. And so as you think about all that, and you think about as you were putting the paper together, and really the whole argument for it, like what was your context for how we got here? Like how do you process that?
So the easy answer, the answer that would have been so much easier for me as I'm writing a book on this and writing all sorts of articles about this, is to imagine that what I'm fighting is a simple enemy. That what I'm fighting is a nemesis, that it's as simple as like just the Death Star, and like one great shot from Luke Skywalker brings it down. It's not. The more complicated story is that the problems that we face emerge from solutions to problems that we used to have. So what does that mean? Think about this as a sort of three-part history of environmentalism in America. Part one is conservation. In the turn of the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt, John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, all these progressives in Washington, D.C., decided to invent something they called a national park. They would draw a line around certain parts of the United States during a period when all sorts of industrialists were running roughshod across the country, and they'd say, no, you cannot run roughshod in Yosemite. You cannot run roughshod in Yellowstone. We were drawing a circle, and we were saying you cannot do business here. That was the age of conservation. But between the age of conservation, the early 1900s, and the 1960s and 1970s, America experienced what you could call a growth machine. We built everything. We built all the roads. We built all the cars. We built all the bridges. We had the Apollo Project and the Tennessee Valley Authority. We had the New Deal. We built all of the interstate highways. We built America. It was an amazing time for building, but it came at a very real cost. Because the 1960s and 1970s, the rivers in Ohio and Pennsylvania were on fire. And there were rivers in New Hampshire that backed up against the textile mills that would run with the color of whatever dye was being used in those textile mills that day. They would run green and then blue and then yellow. We were destroying the air and destroying the planet. There was lead that was poisoning our children. We were growing, but at a terrible cost. And you had a revolution. You had an environmentalist revolution, the late 1960s and early 1970s. You had Silent Spring, and you had 11 laws passed between 1968 and 1973, like NEPA and the Clean Air and Water Act, and we cleaned up the country. We said you cannot grow at no cost, at no expense. You have to consider the environment. And my thesis is that the medicine of the 20th century has become the disease of the 21st century. Environmentalists and right-thinking liberals made it so difficult to build anything that now the laws that we passed to save the environment in the 1960s and 1970s actually hurt the environment in the 21st century. Because the only way to save the world and not destroy our material well-being is to decarbonize the economy. But you can't know your way to decarbonization. N-O. You have to build your way to decarbonization. You have to build solar panels and build wind turbines and build nuclear power plants and build interstate transmission lines to carry the clean, renewable electricity from state to state. And we can't build anymore. And so what we need is a synthesis. We've had the age of conservation. That was the progressive age, the early 1900s. We've had the age of regulation for the last 60 years. We need an age of abundance, an age of clean growth, where we, yes, prioritize growth, but also with the understanding that we cannot grow and we cannot live like it's 1870 anymore. We need a new paradigm, but that paradigm has to put growth front and foremost.
So as you dig into that a little bit more, maybe get even more specific on a couple of areas, and maybe some specific examples about that. I think one of the big topics in our state with our new governor is housing, and thinking about housing and production and the associated infrastructure to support that. So take us down another notch into maybe a housing discussion around the abundance agenda.
Well, there's no question that if you look at this historically, the US, the 1940s and 1950s, led the developed, rich world when it came to houses per capita. We now lag almost every single country in the OECD in houses per capita. We have an extraordinary housing shortage across the country, and it is particularly bad, I have to say, in blue states, and it is particularly bad in deep blue cities within blue states. I wish, like I said, that this is the kind of problem that we could solve the same way that Luke Skywalker solved the problem with the Death Star in Episode 4. Just one well-fired shot into the hole, bring down the entire Death Star, and voila, the housing shortage is over.
Yeah.
It's not like that. The easy story is not the true story here. Oregon banned single-family zoning in 2019. That's not bringing down the Death Star. Because even if you ban single-family zoning, you still have a permitting process such that, as I recall in my brief conversations with the governor, it takes something like 27 different permitting filings in order for any new construction to begin. If you have rules and laws that make it complicated and difficult to do something, you will get less of that thing. I mean, just look at something like parking laws. It's really easy where I live in Washington, D.C. and in the Virginia suburbs to build a mall. It's really easy to build a strip mall because you just have the strip mall and it's set back from the street and you have a bunch of parking in front of the strip mall, and so it of course meets the parking requirements. And so what do you have in Northern Virginia where I live? Malls and malls and malls. I lived for 7 years in New York City, where I'd never lived in Brooklyn, but I walked by the Brooklyn brownstones, which maybe you're familiar with if you spend time in Brooklyn or just seeing them on the internet. It is illegal to build a Brooklyn brownstone basically anywhere in this country because of parking requirements. We have rules that say, here are the requirements, and the world that we live in is downstream of the rules that we write. So my clarion call to people is, you can't just say that 60 years of an era of regulation can be undone with one governor's signature that eliminates single-family zoning. We're talking about 60 years of regulations and rules, and I think we'll get to this in a second, mindsets. This really does come down, I think, sometimes to the question of, what do we want? We say we want houses, and we say that we want our home values to remain where they are without any possible threat of nearby apartment construction. And we say sometimes that we don't like the noise from construction, and sometimes we don't like to have to detour around houses that are being built. And we also say that we like the environment. And so sometimes our priorities are caught inside of this nest of other priorities. And if we really are going to make a priority of housing, we actually have to, this sounds so stupid, but it's true, make a priority of housing with the understanding that it will sometimes, in prioritizing that thing, come at the expense of other priorities. But those are hard decisions. And they're decisions that make us question all of these different values that we have accreted over the last 60 years of being comfortable in a paradigm where we just don't build stuff. And we become comfortable with the world in which we just don't build stuff. And the people who do build don't get enough practice building stuff. I mean, I'm going on a tangent now, but one of the reasons why, for example, I think nuclear power plants, which are so critical for zero carbon energy generation, are unbelievably expensive to build in America, and something like 7 to 8 times cheaper to build in South Korea, is very simply that South Korea builds nuclear power plants in the 21st century. So they have practice. And in practice, they come down a learning curve. And in coming down the learning curve, they find more efficient ways to do it. And the efficiency of building nuclear power plants gives the next marginal nuclear power plant builder the confidence that they can build a nuclear power plant. But if you never start this flywheel of progress, if you never start this flywheel of building, you will never reach the point where building is easy, and therefore it will only be hard. And it will only be harder for the next revolutionary, the next progressive, to come into office and say, I want to do something big. Well, you haven't started yet, so it's going to be really, really hard. And I guess this just comes back to the idea that you have to decide, not just as a governor's office, not just as a legislature, but as a public, as a citizenry, that this is your priority. Housing is your priority, and you're willing to sacrifice other priorities in service to it.
Okay, that was fantastic. Let's go down one other rabbit hole, okay? We went down housing, let's go down education. So we have, as a state, education has been a priority for quite a while. We are coming off of a teacher strike here in Portland, which has just been resolved. Don't expect you to know everything about state education policy and what's happening here. But maybe take us out of our state for a second and maybe give us a little bit of a state of the union on education from your perspective nationally and what you're seeing and how this is being managed across the country.
Well, here's what I see in education. Every few years, PSIA does an international standardized test to judge how different students in America versus other countries in the OECD and Japan and Scandinavia are doing on reading and math tests for older middle schoolers. And you've heard a lot in America about the decline in reading scores since the pandemic, right? That learning loss has been particularly acute in reading. This is something that Senator Wyden was talking about in the seat, I believe. The US actually does better than many other similarly rich countries on literacy. Where we really fall behind, and where we have fallen behind consistently for the last 10 years, is in math. If you look at a graph of US PISA math scores versus other similarly rich countries, it's not just that our math scores have declined in the last 3 years since the pandemic. They've declined almost linearly for the last decade. What I would ask is, where's that conversation? Who at the national level is saying, you know what's really, really important for an economy that we have every reason to think is going to go deeper into software, deeper into computer programming, deeper even in the life sciences into computational biology, figuring out what to do with people's genomics, what to do with people's genomes, and how we can compare genomes in order to identify biomarkers and design certain drugs. For all of these jobs that are going to make the world a better place, we need to be world-class at math. But at every decile of math score, not just the worst performing students, but also the best performing students, they're all getting worse over time, right? Just to be clear, even the 90th percentile math student in America is doing several points worse today than he or she were doing 10 years ago. Why? How? Have we forgotten math principles? Clearly not. It's not in our understanding of math, it's in the execution of the teaching of math. What happened? I don't have the answer to this, but these are the kind of questions that I would like to be asked at both the national and the local level. We know that this kind of education is absolutely core to the future of our economy, and therefore to the future of our children's ability to get high-paying jobs when they graduate from high school or college. Why are we having an across-the-board failure in an ability to raise math scores in this country across a decade? Those are the kind of questions that I would like to be asked.
Yeah, and it might actually be the best return on our investment.
Yeah.
For the work that we need to do over the next decade. All right, so let's pull us back out a little bit here and back to the abundance agenda and make the moral case for that. Make the moral case for growth as you talk about growth and having more, and let's dig into that a little bit.
This is a tough issue. There are a lot of liberals and a lot of progressives right now that are feeling themselves pulled toward an ideology that is sometimes called degrowth. And the degrowth ideology, we were just talking about priorities a little bit ago. The degrowth ideology essentially says, if your priority is saving the biosphere, then you should be willing to sacrifice economic growth to save the biosphere. What we should do in order to save the planet is to restrict growth and have a kind of centrally planned economy that ensures biospherical success. To that, I would say a few things. First, if you look across countries, as they get richer, the carbon density of economic activity tends to decline. Countries tend to get more efficient with their energy usage as they get richer. So it's a false idea. It is a myth that as countries get richer, they become more wasteful with energy. No, in fact, as most countries get richer, they find ways to do more with less. And so if what we want is for the world to be saved, we should actually hope for countries to get richer and to figure out more problems through technology and innovation to make their activities more energy efficient. The second thing I would say is that we live in a democracy in which all of our policies are downstream of political elections. And the degrowth ideology essentially goes to the public and says, I know my opponent is promising to raise your living standards, but I promise you I won't let that happen. That doesn't make any sense to me. You're not going to win any election by promising people that their living standards will be sacrificed on the altar of endangered species. You have to find some way of telling people that they can have their cake and eat it too, because I think in some ways we've shown that we can. So I want people to fall back in love with growth. I want them to see that when the middle class grows, it's good for incumbents. And when incumbents maintain power, they can do complicated and sometimes even unpopular things, like find a way to build more housing even when there are other really powerful interest groups that are trying to find ways to get them to not do that. So I'm a huge fan of moral growth. I'm a huge fan in finding new paradigms for moral growth. And I think it's absolutely essential that even as liberals in particular offer up a message to their voters of protecting the planet, they don't twin that message with a message of degrowth. They say, no, we can save the environment and we can invest in clean energy, and you can have your cake and eat it too. One last point I guess I would make on this is I think that too often environmentalism can be a kind of sort of a deficit mindset. There's an attitude that I think emerged in the 1970s that is that of sort of recycle and reuse. That environmentalism isn't about living a better life, it's about sacrificing for the sake of the planet. But I think that one of the wonders of clean energy innovation, of solar energy and wind energy and geothermal and nuclear, is that you can have more energy, more wealth, while reducing your carbon footprint. And I would love a message to come from the left, or come even from the center left, that says, this is not about getting you to live a worse life on behalf of the environment. This is actually getting you to live a more awesome life, but with electric cars and with abundant energy that, yes, comes from renewable sources.
Excellent, thank you. So do you see, do you have any examples, or have you seen where states, or maybe on a national level, where people, the inertia, they're able to overcome it, and you're starting to see some change out there? Anything out there that you point to and say, these people are doing it, or they're moving towards the right way?
Yeah, I would answer that it's not so much that it's happening at a state-by-state level, which I believe it is. I think it's absolutely happening in California. I mean, you listen to the way that the governors of Oregon and California talk. They talk in this abundance mindset. They talk about more houses. They're proud of new renewable energy generation. They're proud of semiconductor manufacturing. They want to build more here. I love that vibe, but I do think it's happening in a way at a national level, rather than so much at a state level. And that goes to this idea that I've really struggled with, because when I started writing about this subject, I would talk to some people that I considered really, really smart. And I would say, what are the most important bottlenecks that we have to building what I call the abundance agenda? And they would say, I think the bottleneck is culture. I think it's mindset. I think it's psychology. And my immediate response to that was like, that's so hippy-dippy and woo-woo. Like, what do you mean it's all about psychology? Like, no, like I'm used to reporting on macroeconomics. Like, this is about numbers. It's about data. We're talking about, it's about regulations. It's about laws. It's about bureaucratic processes. It's about complicated stuff. And the more I read about this, and the more people I talk to, and the deeper I get into the subject, the more I'm persuaded that actually it might all come down to mindset. I don't want to say it all comes down to vibes, but it might come down to something like ideology. I think that people carry with them a certain sense of what is good and bad in the world. And I think that people in the late 19th century, when we were like in the pure go-go era of American growth with absolutely no care for environmentalism. Maybe, I think go-go was like a cue to the...
I think Siri, that must have been Siri.
That's exactly the vibe that was going on inside of the late 19th century industrial.
That was Siri, yeah.
They were like, we're going to kill all the bison. That's how it feels.
Cue the music, okay.
We don't think like that anymore, right? We don't think like that anymore. We have a different mindset. And to a certain extent, I do think that you have to, as absurd and like childish as this is about to sound, you have to find some way to make these ideas cool. You have to find a way to make growth cool. You have to find a way to make calling for more housing cool. Because that ideology has to succeed at several levels. It has to succeed at the level of getting a voter to check your name on a ballot. It has to succeed in the level of talking to special interest groups once you get power. It has to succeed in the level of getting the legislature to go with you because they trust that the voters are now on your side when it comes to this idea of, yeah, building ships in Oregon is cool. Building solar energy in this country is cool. Building wind turbines just off the coast is cool. And so it sounds so simplistic and stupid and like high schoolish to say that what we need to do is make these ideas cool. But weirdly, the more sophisticated I find myself going into these subjects, the more I find myself pulling out of this and feeling unsophisticated about my thesis statement, which is, no, fundamentally, we need to change mindsets. We need to get people to feel like growth is cool, and clean energy is cool, and building stuff in America is cool, and calling for abundance is cool, and asking for degrowth, and asking to stop, and saying no to projects that can allow thousands of people to move into our state. That ain't cool. It's difficult to do. It's difficult to work at the level of vibes. But fundamentally, I think that especially maybe in a social media mediated age, when so many people interact with government at the level of, let's be honest, frankly, memes, you have to be willing to play at that level. And that's really difficult work. But I think it's really important too.
It's important. And I think, another important topic, and we didn't prep for this, so be ready. So the next section of this morning is going to be about our Central City Task Force and the work that came together to talk about Portland, and not just Portland, but really our cities in general around the state. And really Portland is a role model for what happens everywhere else. And I listened to your podcast from last spring, I think it was, about cities and what was going on with cities in America. And I'm just curious, as we kind of bridge into the back half of our morning, kind of what your perspective is on the big city. What's your perspective? And I think that every part of the country is having different experiences related to what's happening with cities. I spend a lot of time in New York, and I see a certain city. It's not the same city that it used to be, but it's a city. I walk the streets of downtown Portland. It's a different city today than it was. And we're working on how do we think about it. And I heard the topic of the urban dilemma. Mm-hmm. And maybe address that for a few minutes here before we go to close.
Yeah, sure. This is a big topic, and big cities are facing a lot of nested problems right now. There's a problem of drug use, there's a problem of homelessness, there's a problem of a feeling of urban decay, and in some cases, a fact of urban decay. And then there are municipal finance problems. There's a lot of cities that finance themselves with business taxes and real estate taxes, and in an era where more companies are going hybrid, the value of corporate buildings is declining, which means the tax revenue that comes from those buildings is declining, which means that municipal revenue is declining, which means that cities are now operating from a deficit, even as they need to find a way to attract more people and, yes, build more apartments for people to live in those cities. So there is, I think, a difficult flywheel that a lot of mayors and a lot of governors are trying to reverse. It is not lost on me, I think this is a point that was made in that podcast, not lost on me, that when you talk to CEOs of white-collar businesses, they can sometimes be a little bit mealy-mouthed or ambiguous in the issue of remote work. On the one hand, they want people in the office. On the other hand, they don't want to drive away workers to some other company that is remote. And so they'll say, we're working on a hybrid model, and maybe we're working on the 3-2 model, 3 days in, 2 days out. But fundamentally, for our high earners, especially those in their sort of middle-aged years who want to be really flexible because parent flexibility is important, and we know that commutes are immiserating, et cetera, et cetera. But when you talk to the mayors and the governors, they say, we got to fix this. You got to come into the office. Come back to the office, replenish our cities, shop on the streets, drive revenue to storefronts, and also raise the value of corporate buildings that are paying property taxes back to the city. We need to fix this problem. So it's not lost on me that the CEOs sometimes are being more ambivalent on the issue of remote work than the governors and the mayors who are seeing this more clearly through a revenue standpoint. Cities face a lot of problems right now, but the biggest myth I could possibly leave you with is that there's some golden age of the city that didn't have problems. Mm-hmm. The cities in the 1970s had a lot of problems. Ford to New York dropped dead. New York was having a lot of problems in the 1970s. You think about an era where I know New York and DC better than I know basically any other city in America. But even in maybe the best years of New York, in the Bloomberg years, the 2000s, the 2010s, home prices were going absolutely crazy. And Michael Bloomberg was talking about his city as like, it was basically just like a bunch of penthouses. That's not what New York is supposed to be. New York is not supposed to be a place where only like double income, no kid dinks and like millionaires can live and no middle income people with families can live. That's not what a city is supposed to be. And so even in the best years of New York, you could argue that New York was running away from its identity. Cities are like live organisms. They're dynamic and they're always changing and there's always going to be problems and they need leaders who understand that dynamism is an inherent part of the job, but they have to find some way of keeping in mind what I believe to be the clear priorities. You need security on the streets and you need more housing. And once you have security on the streets and more housing, it's my belief that a lot of economic benefits redound from that, are downstream of that. If you have housing, you have more people that can live in the city, you have more service workers and more young people that contribute to the service industry, but also creativity in that city. And once you set those sort of basic ingredients, a lot can sort of flow out of that petri dish of urban life. So security and housing are so foundational for me when it comes to sort of rescuing cities from the doom loop that they face right now. But I know that it's more complicated than that, and I know that cities always have and always will face enormous challenges because they are hard animals to wrangle.
And to your point, this is not a new thing. This has happened over generations of time. It's just our turn to fix it.
Yes.
All right, we have a minute left. Final thoughts as we think big about Oregon and we think about, like, what's a realistic vision for a state like Oregon as we think about solving big challenges?
I think Oregon is such an incredibly interesting test case of my theory of the three eras of environmentalism. And this is a city that is proudly and famously environmentalist, that has just beautiful landscapes and whose growth management policies from the 1970s on have tried to be thoughtful about how do we build while respecting the fact that we live within natural splendor and we want to find some way to live in a city that has prosperity and has natural wildness. And this is an amazing place, I think, to serve as a petri dish of my theory that we are hopefully entering this third era of environmentalism in America. We had the era of conservation where people in Washington, D.C., technocrats drew circles on an American map and said no government can enter here. And then we had the era of regulation where, in truthful recognition of the fact that our air and our water had been destroyed by industrialism, passed laws like NEPA and the Clean Air and Water Act that did clean up the country, but also in conjunction with growth management policies made it really difficult to build the housing and clean energy infrastructure that we need in order to thrive in the 21st century. We need a 21st century synthesis of growth and environmentalism. And I cannot think of a better place than Oregon to test the proposition that that new paradigm is possible.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, Derek Thompson, you're going to switch chairs in a few hours and you'll be interviewing the governor.
That's right.
Thank you for being here. Really appreciate your words, and we'll see you in a couple hours.
Great.
Thank you. Derek
Thanks.
Thompson. Thank you. Appreciate it.